Okay, perfect. So thank you all for coming to the Pines of Kentucky class. So for the next few months, our Zoom classes are going to be focused on the different trees that are found here in Kentucky. Today, we're going to actually be focusing on our native conifers. The other ones are kind of more focused on some of our more deciduous tree species. Next month, March 17th, we're going to be talking about ash trees. And of course, what comes with the ash trees is the emerald ash borer. So next next month's talk is going to kind of focus on not just the trees, but the invasive pest as well. So if you haven't signed up for that, be sure to come through our office and sign up. As always, our recordings can be found on the YouTube channel, which I'll have this class posted this afternoon. But otherwise, let's go ahead and get started on pines. So I gave this to you last month, but a lot of people always ask what are some good references, especially when it comes to trees. And so an oldie but a goodie is the Trees and Shrubs of Kentucky book, as well as our Tree Finder book, which is a small pocket guide that you can easily carry with you hiking. And then, of course, we've got different websites, our Kentucky Native Plant Society, nearby states like Missouri, and even surprisingly North Carolina, they have a great plant database. So even though they're a few states away, a lot of times they have similar plant species that we have that you can easily utilize them. But of course, we also have our Department of Forestry and Natural Resources, and they are a great resource. And with our department, they do a weekly webinar called From the Woods Today, and they've actually done several videos on our different tree species. So you definitely need to check them out because they are certainly the experts when it comes to trees. And then we, of course, have things like our Arbor Day Foundation, as well as our state Kentucky Division of Forestry, as well, are great resources for you. So let's start off with our basic question, which are what are pines? What are pine trees? In particular, we're talking about the genus Pinus and the Pinaceae family. So we kind of estimate, give or take, there's about 115 species. This can kind of vary, just depending. As I've mentioned before, with botanists doing more molecular genetic studies, we're finding that a lot of species might be more closely related to each other than we originally thought, or maybe they're not as closely related. So we are seeing a lot more of kind of shuffling among some of our genera and our plant families. But with pine trees, especially that we'll talk about with them being gymnosperms, them kind of being an older plant species when it comes to our natural history. I don't want to say they're pretty well set in stone, but they're pretty easy to identify and not quite as confusing as some of our others. So with pine trees, these are going to be primarily evergreen conifers. And so with that, they hold their foliage. In this case, these are needle-like leaves that they house in bundles. They will hold these the whole year. Now, with that said, when we talk about some of these species today, they will shed their leaves sometimes every couple years. It's actually very common for pine trees to shed some of their leaves every 2 or 3 years. And that's not anything unusual. It's not anything to be concerned about. It's when we start to see cases of severe needle drop that we have to be worried about certain environmental factors or diseases. So with pines, they all are going to have these bundles of these needle-like leaves. Now, these are found throughout the world. They are found in our northernmost forests, our boreal forests. They could be in a forest that's primarily pine, or we also do have mixed woodlands as well. So we could potentially have a pine oak mixed forest, especially when it comes to eastern white pines, but we'll kind of get into that as well. But the characteristics that not only pine trees have, but they have with other conifers is the fact that they are what we call gymnosperms. And gymnosperms means naked seed. And basically what that means is these are vascular plants, meaning these are plants that have tissues, your xylem, phloem, things of that nature, where nutrients and water go through the plant, and they reproduce through what we call exposed seeds. And oftentimes these seeds are found in cones. Now, the difference is we have another category called angiosperm. These are our flowering plants, and those are not naked seeds. Those seeds in angiosperms are actually protected by the ovary or the fruit casing itself. And so this might be like a little bit more information than you wanted to know, but I'm going to go ahead and tell you a little bit about it. Is kind of the brief history, the reproductive cycle of pine trees. And specifically, let's talk about pine cones. And so with pine cones, we call these strobilus. And on a
Got it.
pine tree, we have both male and female strobili. Okay, so we have a male cone and we have a female cone. Now, oftentimes the male cone is called the microstrobilus, the female cone is called the macrostrobilus, and they are found on the same plant. Okay,
Who
and
knows?
just kind of think of male and female flowers, even though these aren't flowers, it's still similar, where you've got the male cone that will release pollen, and that pollen is going to be wind pollinated. That pollen is going to go over to the female cone and become fertilized. So you can kind of see at the bottom of this diagram here, this is a female strobilus prior to fertilization. You can kind of see where the ovule's located, and then after fertilization, that female strobilus is actually going to mature. The seed is going to form and mature itself, and that that cone's going to become more woody in nature. Okay. Now, as for the male cone, as soon as it releases the pollen, it's gone. Okay, it's going to start to die away. And so oftentimes we may not even really notice the male cone on the tree until after it's already pollinated the female cone. And unless we're really kind of, I mean, I love to look at my pine trees just because I love nature and I love being outdoors. But a lot of people don't even notice, it seems, the cones until they start falling from the tree itself, and then they're in the landscape and on the lawn. Um, but once um, the female cone has completely matured, it's been fertilized, and the seed matures itself, then the seed will easily from weather, from animals, be released into the environment. And of course, it'll go down to the ground, and if it has good contact with the soil, you're going to get seedlings start to pop up. So that's kind of the overall life cycle of pine trees. And again, this is kind of the case with a lot of different conifer species. Um, so that's just kind of in a nutshell. And if you look early on, you may see in the season, like the cones start to look different colors or start to look different shapes, or and so I kind of encourage you to do that just so you can see the different part of the life cycles of the pine cones. I've got quite a bit of loblolly pines near my house, and so I pretty much watch them every year. Okay. Let's talk about the importance of pine trees from an economical and an ecological standpoint. So let's talk about it from an economical standpoint. We talked about this with maples last month with, of course, maple syrup. So let's talk about it for pine trees. So pine trees are very important lumber. They're used in quite a bit of different construction materials. Uh, Pine was very popular, I would say, kind of years ago, and then it kind of fizzled out. And then some people are using pine a little bit more now in, say, construction of homes. Um, they're often used quite a bit in paper products. They're also used in the creation of different types of oils and turpentine, wood tars, things of that nature. But then also, we may not think about it from this. A lot of times, we're only thinking about it from a lumber standpoint, where they can be used as Christmas trees. Now, not all pine trees may be best served as Christmas trees compared to, say, some of our firs. A lot of our firs are very popular Christmas trees. But so it may not be the number one choice, but they can be used in the Christmas tree industry. And then the pine nuts, the seeds, even though we think of it just for animals consuming them, they are edible. And we use pine nuts in a range of different culinary purposes and cooking. I particularly love pine nuts whenever I mix that with basil. So, people will use different recipes like that. And then, of course, ornamental landscaping. A lot of pines are used as maybe privacy borders, uh, just to have that evergreen, just in case there's some kind of eyesore in their landscaping. Uh, we'll talk about that a little bit, but I've got like a whole nother class and it's recorded on the website about why certain conifers are not great for landscape plants, and some of our pines are not the greatest for landscape plants either, even if they're native here, because they just may not do well in a more landscape type setting versus the natural setting that they're used to. But again, we'll focus in on that here with a particular species. From an ecological standpoint, of course, with any trees, they serve as habitat and shelter for all kinds of animals, from your different bird species to small mammals, insect species. They are important nesting sites. And then, of course, the seeds from the pine itself are important food sources for a lot of our rabbits, squirrels, and our different bird species. Something else to think about, though, especially even if you are planting these like in a landscape setting, but also in its natural environment, with pine trees, they are important as acting as natural wind barriers, helping to reduce erosion, stabilize soil, things like that. Let me briefly talk about this lovely little bird that's up here. This cute little yellow bird, as I really love birds and am a birder, I have to take this opportunity to talk about our pine warbler. So that's what this picture is. This is of a pine warbler. And this is found in the eastern United States. Particularly, it's prevalent in eastern white pine forests, although they are not just specific to eastern white pines, they can be found on other species of pine trees. But you can imagine their life cycle is really important. It's really needed when it comes to pine trees. They rely on the seeds for food, and then it is the pine, they will nest exclusively in pine trees. Like that is their nesting site. So they heavily rely on pine trees. And so what I'm getting at is if you don't have the pine trees, you don't have the warbler. And so that is where we have to be really mindful of things like habitat destruction, deforestation, things like that, that could be not only putting our plant species at risk, but the insect and bird populations that come with it. And so again, with this pine warbler, it needs to have these pine trees in order to complete its life cycle, if you will. Now, they can be pretty hard to spot. A lot of times you're going to see these more higher up in the pine tree in the higher branches. And they're going to kind of prod on some of those clumps of little needles with their bills. But they are they're adorable. I've seen a couple of them in my birding adventures, and they are you can see here kind of that vibrant yellow color that you can't miss. And so for that, with that in mind, just be thinking about aspects on how it is important that we have these different types of plant species to support our different animal and insect species as well. So what pines are found in Kentucky? And we're going to go in depth with all of these. So technically, we only have 4 pines that are native to Kentucky. I did add a 5th one, our loblolly pine, because even though it's technically non-native, it's more found south. It's more of a southern pine species. It has been planted pretty heavily here in Kentucky that people almost treat it like it's native. It's not invasive or anything of that nature. And so I will go ahead and talk about loblolly as well. But the ones that we're going to focus on today are eastern white pine, pitch pine, shortleaf, and Virginia. Okay. So I'm going to talk about eastern white pine maybe a little bit more than the other pine species, just because there's quite a bit I want to talk to you about, especially because this is what we kind of see as more of a common landscape plant as well. But eastern white pine is found, it's native to the eastern United States, especially along the Appalachian Mountain Range. It likes to have full sun. It likes moist soil, but it doesn't like soggy soil. And that's going to get into some of the issues that we find with white pine here in a minute. That soil needs to be well draining. In particular, they prefer more of a sandy loam. They do not do well in our heavy clay soils, which is problematic here in West Kentucky. They also like it to be a little bit more cool and humid, which is why they may thrive a little bit better, again, kind of in the eastern half of the state versus the western half. And this is also a tree that does not tolerate air pollutants as well. As we got into that with some of our maple species, there are some trees that really don't do well in urbanized settings, especially if there is a lot of air pollution. This is going to be a relatively tall tree, can grow up to 50 to 80 feet tall. How you can distinguish it from other pine trees is that it has these bluish green needles, and the bundles are always in bundles of 5. And so that's kind of the first thing I do, especially if I see a pine tree and from a distance, I'm not quite sure what it is. I'll immediately go and check and see how many bundles of needles there are, because that can be a really good distinguishing factor in figuring out what type it is. So with eastern white pine, it's a bundle of 5. If you need to remember that, just think of, the word white, and white has 5 letters. for 5 needles. I learned that in college, so that helped me remember. When it comes to the cone itself, these are going to be relatively narrow cones, and the scales kind of towards the tip are going to be a little bit more whitish in color. Now, I will say with Eastern white pines, they're not going to be producing their cones until they're about 5 to 10 years old. Kind of think of some of these trees like fruit trees. They may not bear fruit for 7 to 10 years. It may take 10 years for some of these pine trees to bear cones. Okay. When it comes to certain aspects of this tree, this is commonly used in the timber industry, and it is very commonly used as a Christmas tree as well. From an ecological standpoint, it's important, especially from seeds eaten by birds, black bears, rabbits, squirrels, and more. But something you may not think about is also even the bark itself is edible to wildlife. And so beavers will utilize the Eastern white pine, and even some of our small rodents will also chew on the bark as well. And when it comes to that, what other animals rely on this, something that you'll notice with a lot of our pine trees is pine trees are important for certain moth larva species, certain moth caterpillars. So like in particular, the imperial moth relies on the different pine trees as part of its life cycle as well. Now, looking at the picture, before I get into some of the disease, pest issues, if you look at the picture of the tree itself, the whole tree, you see some yellowing needles. There's actually nothing wrong with this picture. There's actually nothing wrong with this tree. That's pretty typical, as I was mentioning earlier. That's pretty normal for these pine trees, again, every couple years to drop their needles. So just seeing some yellow needles is perfectly fine. It's when we start to see heavy defoliation of those needles that it's just going to be concerning. So with that, let's talk about some of those other issues. So we have a great publication. So if you were to Google, like just type this into Google, PPFSORW22 that I have down here, that will take you right to our publication page from Plant Pathology. And it talks about the different issues that affect white pines. And so I just want to go ahead and mention these a little bit because a lot of people do grow white pines here in West Kentucky, but sometimes they don't fare so well. And so I want to give you a couple of reasons why it may not be doing very well. So there is the issue called white pine decline, just a general white pine decline. And this is where you just, start to see dieback in the plant. Eventually, it could completely die off, and you're just looking at it and you're like, what happened with this tree? Why did it die on me? I thought it was fine. There could be a number of reasons for that. Number one is high soil pH. So high soil pH meaning it's greater than 7 on a pH scale. It's very alkaline. Okay. Eastern white pines prefer it to be a little bit more acidic, more 5.5 to 6.5. And so whenever you have a high soil pH, sometimes that causes some of these trees, plant species, to not be able to have access to nutrients that's in the soil, whereas they would be more readily available if it was at a lower pH. So that's number one. It may not be getting the nutrients it needs, it's too alkaline. The other thing is heavy clay content. As I said, this prefers sandy loam soils. And so if you are planting your Eastern white pine in an area around your property where that topsoil has been completely removed and all that's left is that heavy clay soil, that is not great for your eastern white pine. Even if it survives for several years, long term, it's not going to thrive and will actually decline probably after it's in the landscape 10 to 15 years. So don't plant it in heavy clay soil. At least amend that soil with some good, rich organic matter that it needs. And you would have to do that over the whole area as it grows and expands its roots. Something else to keep in mind is compacted soil. Okay, they don't do well in compacted soil. It does not do well if it's close to a structure, sidewalk, driveway, anywhere there could be construction, or you risk that soil really becoming compacted as a result of, what's going on in that area around it. And kind of with that said, it's not going to do well if its roots are disturbed in it anyway after it's established in the landscape for several years. So say this is like an extreme example, but say like you're getting ready to put a pool in your backyard and you have to like strip that whole area and you have an eastern white pine that's near there, even if it's not directly where the pool was. Um, if any of its root system gets hit by some of that construction or removed, it's going to be pretty well a goner. So it's not a tree that's going to adapt very well to a lot of environmental changes. So keep that in mind with eastern white pines. And then one other thing I'll mention with the eastern white pines, because um, you all know I've been here for several years now. I do a lot of site visits to people's properties. And one of the number one things I see whenever there's a declining white pine is it's susceptible to a disease called white pine root decline. And that's caused by a fungal disease infecting the root system. Very similar in a way to our root rot diseases. Um, and so a lot of times what we notice with white pine root decline is the tree could be infected for many years before you start to notice any types of symptoms. Then all of a sudden, maybe a different time of the year, may not be the right time of the year. All of a sudden, you just see heavy needle browning. Just all of a sudden, a very sudden, heavy needle browning, needle drop. And honestly, if you're not quick about it or quick about calling me to come out and look at it, sometimes the tree could very well be dead, like before I get out there. Death is going to occur relatively quickly after you start to see symptoms of that needle browning. Another symptom that you can notice, and I have it in this picture here of the trunk, you all are seeing this trunk, you're probably noticing that kind of where the bark has been removed, there's this discolored tissue. The fungus will infect the internal tissue. And then on the outside, you see all of this sap that is being exuded. A lot of times, whenever I go and I look at a white pine and I immediately see sap at the trunk, that's like my indicator. Oh boy, we've got white pine root decline. And so with that, there's no cure. Once it's infected, and unfortunately, it's going to die. This isn't the only pine tree that could be infected by this fungal disease. If you have any Austrian or Scots pines, they can also be impacted heavily. Although those are two pines I wouldn't recommend planting here in West Kentucky. They just don't tend to do well here. And so kind of with that in mind, if you do have white pine root decline, you're seeing these symptoms and your pine trees end up dying, my recommendation is that you completely remove the tree, including the stump, which I know that is a very costly expense. But you need to remove the trunk and the whole stump because this fungal pathogen can easily linger in the stump. It can linger in the soil surrounding that whole area. And so with that, you're not going to want to replant any white pines in that same vicinity for many, many years. And even I wouldn't recommend putting any other type of pines in that area just out of an abundance of caution. And you might be saying, well, how the heck did it get infected by this disease to begin with? And more than likely, you planted your white pine in a really wet spot. Okay. And that's the trick, and that's the balancing act where these like moist soil, but that soil needs to be well draining. If you're planting it in a flood prone area where it's going to stay soggy for a long period of time, that is going to result in a lot of these root rot diseases coming and infecting those trees. So if you have white pine root decline, it is probably because it was planted in too wet of a site. So just something to know, because I mean, I know I'm kind of pushing this quite a bit, but I see this a lot. I see this a lot. Anytime somebody calls me and they're like, I have a pine tree in decline, like 9 out of 10 times it's because of this. So just something to know that with white pines, even though they are native to Kentucky, they also may fare better more kind of on the eastern side of the state. They may not grow quite as well in our West Kentucky counties, especially in those types of conditions. So anyway, that's my soapbox for Eastern white pine. And I make it out to seem like I hate Eastern white pine, and I absolutely adore Eastern white pine. I'm from Pennsylvania. I'm used to seeing Eastern white pine everywhere, and I love this tree. I just hate to see this tree suffer because it was not planted under the right conditions. So that's why. Okay, with that, let's move on to another tree. Like I said, I had to talk about Eastern white pine for a little bit here. All right, loblolly pine. So as I mentioned before, this is not truly native to Kentucky, meaning when I say native, this tree existed in our geographic range prior to colonization. That's not the case with this one. This is a pine tree that was more typically found in the further southeastern part of the United States, is its typical range. Okay. But it does well here. It does well here in our Kentucky climate. It's been planted quite a bit um, for landscaping, kind of again as privacy borders. And so it's one that we just see frequently. So it's, to me, it's worth talking about here in this lecture today. So with loblolly pines, just a couple of things about it, some characteristics. It is very common for loblolly pines as they mature, as they age, to lose its lower branches. So if you have some around where you live and you worry about those branches frequently falling, it's probably not anything to worry about. It just typically likes to shed its lower branches. In that regard, it might be a little bit messy of a tree. And so you may not want to put it anywhere where it could be too inconvenient to clean up. You also probably don't want to be planting this anyway if it's near a shed or your home, just because it's going to be very flammable. That again sounds kind of like common sense, but think about this. We have really dry summer. We have dry needles. Okay, probably high flammability. So probably don't want to keep pine trees too close to your home for that purpose. But if you do have a larger property, further away, and it's not as much of a concern, you can plant it there. The great thing about loblolly pines, it's going to tolerate different soil conditions a lot better than your eastern white pine. It likes moist, low areas. It even does well with poor drainage, unlike your eastern white pine. It can tolerate a little bit of drought too as well though, but it is going to like some moisture. It loves full sun. It loves hot, humid summers. And that's why it's great more as a southern tree option. Uh, it may struggle or have a little bit of winter damage if we get a really cold, extreme winter, which sometimes that might be possible. It is a pine that is going to prefer more mild winters. So this tree is about a medium-sized tree. It could get up to 90 feet if it's given the proper environment, but typically if it's more in our landscape, it's only going to get to about 40 to 50 feet tall. But why a lot of people love it and why it's been planted so frequently is because it's a very fast-growing pine tree. So you know how people, they need their borders, they need their natural screens quickly, and they're going to plant these because they're going to be fast growing. Although, as I said, they may not be the most effective use as a screen just because they're going to drop those lower branches. So you might have some naked areas, if you will, where you could see into your neighbor's yard if that's the case. Um, with loblollies, unlike the eastern white pine that has more that bluish green coloration, this is more yellow green needles, and the needles are typically in bundles of three. So loblolly has bundles of three, and as we'll talk about, a lot of our pine trees typically have needle bundles that are two or three. Eastern white pine is kind of a little bit different where that's always generally five. Sometimes you can look at the overall structure of the pine tree though and how it grows. And even if you're not up close to it or you're looking at like the bundles of needles, you can kind of figure out that this is a loblolly. So this kind of has a more dense oval crown whenever it matures. The bark will begin to furrow as it ages and maintain that gray coloration. The cones themselves, they have what we call recurved spines. So with some of our pine trees, some of the cones have spines on them, and that could give you a pretty decent paper cut if you're not careful. So you may want to handle it with gloves because they can be they can poke you pretty good, kind of like a cactus. But this is going to be kind of a more bulky cone with those spines. And that's another good indicator with trying to figure out the pine species too, is does it have this spine or not? When it comes to other aspects of this tree, it does support animal populations. It supports our insect populations like our moss species as well that we talked about. But it also is commonly used in the timber industry for pulp, plywood, and other types of construction materials. More than likely, if you see kind of a row of pines here in West Kentucky, more than likely it's going to be loblolly pines, just for how they've been planted and how readily they were available for, say, different Arbor Day events. One of the more common pine species that we have. Pitch pine. Okay. This one is not as common in Kentucky. You might see this kind of more out east. It actually prefers to be more along the Atlantic coast on the coastal plain. I actually see pitch pine so often in Pennsylvania. Where I come from in Pennsylvania, pitch pine is very common. And it was kind of a little bit of a changeover from woodlands from coming from Pennsylvania to Kentucky because here I hardly ever see pitch pine, and in Pennsylvania I see it everywhere. So, it just depends on the, geographic range. But we do have pitch pine. It can grow in a diverse type of soils in that regard. It's a little bit more tolerant. It does still prefer moist, well-draining soil, and it's going to like full sun. This is another decent sized tree, getting up to 50 to 80 feet tall. You can kind of identify it compared to, like, say, your loblolly, in that it has more of an unruly growth habit, if you will. It's more irregular in shape. It doesn't have kind of more of this maintained structure, if you will. It has a very open, what we call open growth habit. Now, the needle bundles are usually bundles of 3, okay? And how you can tell is they are slightly twisted needles, okay? So if you're trying your bundles of 3 compared to your loblolly, and you're trying to figure out the difference, these actually have slightly twisted needles. And the needles are going to vary in coloration on your pitch pine from yellow green to dark green. The bark is actually a little bit different too. So bark is a good indicator for identification. Unlike your gray furrowed bark on the loblolly, the pitch pine is going to be more of the scaly reddish brown coloration to the bark. The pine cones are also very different. They're more of a lighter brown color. They're kind of more curved, and they do have pines, but sorry, spines. I'm talking pine, spine, pine, spine. I'm getting tongue-tied here. Sorry. They do have kind of these smaller, stiff spines to them. See, I can't, y'all. I'm talking about too many spines and pines. It's driving me nuts. All right. Anyway. But you can see an example of the cone here in the picture. With pitch pine, it's still of somewhat economical importance. It is used for pulp in the lumber industry. But this isn't really, this pine is just found and kind of in its native range. I don't really see it used much as a landscaping tree or anything of that nature. Okay, you're just going to kind of see in the woodlands, these pitch pines. Short leaf pine. So this is actually similar to your loblolly in that has more of a natural range of the southeastern United States. Kind of preferring more of those more mild winters and hot, humid summers. It's going to prefer full sun, well-draining soil, does prefer sandy loam, but can tolerate, different soil conditions. This is going to be a little bit taller of a pine compared to the others. This can get up to 80 to 100 feet tall. So if you do see like this random towering pine tree and you're like, what is that? Especially if the crown of it looks pyramidal in shape, and it literally looks like it's got like no lower branches, more than likely it's probably a short leaf pine. So this picture here is actually a good representation of, after a while, what this pine tree can look like. Okay. And I will say it is fast growing, but it's slower to mature when it comes to its pine cone. With shortleaf pine, it can take up to 20 years before it's going to produce its pine cone. Um, and the pine cone itself does have these smaller, shorter spines. And the colors, depending on if it's male or female cone, it looks a little bit different. Whereas the male cone almost has this purplish color, female is almost pinkish. And of course, as it matures, it gets more woody over time too. And something else I didn't really mention, but I should have mentioned before, is pine trees. Some of them will drop their pine cones pretty quickly, and others will hold on to their pine cones for longer periods of time. So this short leaf pine will actually hold on to its pine cone for years, actually. That cone, even after, it's been fertilized, And even if the seeds have been taken, like it will not eject its cone for many, many years. So that also can help be a good indicator for you with figuring out what pine tree this is, if this is a certain one that's going to hold on to its cones longer than other ones. So this is an example of that. Now, when it comes to other aspects of the shortleaf pine, this is very commonly harvested in our southern states for lumber, plywood, wood pulp. It is great cover for our birds and animal species, supporting our moss species. They all rely on shortleaf pine. And this is one that we would see also potentially doing fine here on the western side of the state as well. All right. Last but not least, let's talk about Virginia pine. So Virginia pine is more prevalent and honestly kind of prefers to be more out in eastern Kentucky, more along the Appalachian Mountain Range. So you're going to see that more there than, I mean, you could see. I I remember talking to Division of Forestry at one point, and they had mentioned that there were some Virginia pines planted in this county. So they are around. Um, but with these, commonly they're going to be found kind of more further east. They prefer well-drained soils, full sun. They can tolerate different types of soil. These are going to be very slow growing though compared to your other pine species. They're going to be more medium size, 40 to 80 feet tall, but they're pretty easy to identify, honestly, because this is kind of your scraggly, kind of your more unmaintained type looking pine tree, if you will. It's gonna look like it's been through a lot. I don't know how it is. It's like it's gonna look like it's had a bad hair day. How about that? Um, it has very spreading branches. It may look a little pyramidal when it's young, but as it ages, it's going to get kind of these more interesting horizontal branches. It's going to be more flat at the top, and again, just look like it's messy. It's just going to look very messy. The needles are usually in bundles of two. So I will say that's a little bit different than the other ones we talked about. So typically bundles of two for this one. Now, when it comes to the pine cone itself, the cone is usually small and it is going to stay on the tree. Okay. So you can kind of get a decent picture of the pine cone. It's a lot more spiny and it definitely, look, trust me. One time I was collecting pine cones of different types, and I think these are the worst ones. Honestly, of all the different pine cones that I've had, I think the Virginia pine's the worst when it comes to its spine. It just hurts. Oh my goodness. So you got to be careful with that, with handling it with gloves. Um, but what's interesting about the pine cones, unlike some of your other pine trees, is these cones will actually stay in clusters on the tree rather than single, rather than individually on the tree. You might get clusters of cones that are in 2 to 4. Again, helps you with identifying some of these tree species as you look at those little aspects of it. Now, with those cones, they take forever to mature. Okay, they will not fully ripen, if you will, till after 2 years old. And so, with that in mind, these cones are going to stay, they're going to linger on this pine tree for a period of time. Okay. So again, that kind of helps you with figuring out what it is. Something I'll also say with Virginia pine, more than likely you'll see this kind of more in groupings, whereas some of the other pine trees may kind of be like one single individual tree, and then you'll get a mess of other trees, and then there'll be another just single individual. This can be found kind of more in groupings, almost like these straggly groupings of this Virginia pine. Kind of like not really a thicket, but in a way, kind of like it can be pretty dense when they're all kind of growing around each other. Um, Again, these are found more at higher elevations in the Appalachian Mountains. But if you're over there, say in eastern Kentucky, you may find these even growing along old fence rows or old fields where there used to be farmland. The the thing about the Virginia pine is a lot of people don't care for it because of its messy structure. So it's never done well as an ornamental. It's been one of the very few pine trees like they've tried to cultivate, if you will. But I will say what it does have going for it is it's pretty tolerant of pollution. So that's a big A plus there. And the other one, which a lot of us think about here, especially in Hopkins County, is it's pretty deer resistant compared to other pine trees because sometimes deer will like to nibble or browse on some of our other pine trees, especially getting some of that tender growth. Um, Especially rubbing against newly planted trees and could be pretty problematic. But this is one that deer are not partial to, so that kind of helps. Again, not that we're really planting this, but if you see kind of a grouping of Virginia pine doing fairly well, um, then that might be one of the reasons. This also is not really a very good pine when it comes to economic importance. They typically don't use this very much for lumber because the wood itself is very knotty and very prone to warping if there's any bit of moisture. So Virginia pine is really just not used for anything other than it hanging out in its natural environment, if I'm being honest with you. Which makes me also appreciate it a little bit better, because of course wildlife they rely on that. But yeah, it's not something that we really see either in the construction industry used or in the landscape industry either. So a lot of times we're just seeing this in its native range. Um, Although sometimes I will say I feel like maybe this is sometimes available at Arbor Day. I may be incorrect about that, but sometimes we may be able to get tree seedlings from different planting events. Um, but anyway, so that I'll go ahead and stop sharing. That is kind of a rundown on the pine trees. So let me go ahead and stop sharing my screen and let me go ahead and stop the recording.